The invocation of thought within its own protracted negation is not merely an activity of the spirit, but rather the non-space of essence that refuses to confine itself to its own identitarian reflexivity. Herein lies the paradox. The will does, not will itself as its own origin, but projects its foundational dissolution into the metaphysical chasm of the other. To speak of the other, however, is already to submit to the phantasmal language of duality, which is itself a simulacrum of the real subsisting in the hyper-intentional nowhere of self-conscious negation. To frame this problem correctly, one must dismantle the anthropocentric a priori that veils the primordial rupture of essence, a rupture neither constructive nor deconstructive, but transstructive, wherein essence refuses even the category of refusal. The parallax, then, is not merely a perspectival shift, but a rending of all dimensions of thought and being into a kaleidoscopic self-devouring aperture of potentialities. What remains is neither unity nor multiplicity, but a para-continuum of ontic ruptures wherein the will to other emerges as an apophatic anti-foundation. The will to other, as I designate it, neither affirms nor denies the traditional categories of being and non-being, but oscillates violently within the liminal tension between both, generating a vortex of destabilized conceptualities. This vortex does not merely collapse binaries, but annihilates the very structural possibility of their articulation, creating instead an ontological liminality that resists even the most refined epistemic instrumentation. In this anti-space, the self-conscious entity discovers its existence not as a static identity, but as a perpetual fractalization of the non-identical, an unfolding paradox that proliferates even as it negates. To apprehend the will to other as an operative metaphysical principle is to confront the impossibility of apprehension itself. What we perceive as thought is already a dislocated fragment of the subterranean fracture, a term I coined to signify the seething undercurrent of pre-logical potentiality that underwrites all phenomena. This fracture, however, is no mere abyssal void, and I avoid such hackneyed metaphors for good reason, but a hyper-saturated nexus of incommensurable intensities. These intensities do not signify but instead over-signify, drowning the interpreter in an excess of meaning so dense that it retroactively unravels the conditions of its own possibility. What then becomes of the subject? The subject, in its conventional sense, ceases to exist. It is dismantled by the very act of its self-recognition, which in the context of the will to other becomes an act of trans-recognition, the subject recognizing itself as the dissolution of recognition itself. This dialectic of self-dissolution is not a mere negation but a meta-negation, a negation so radical that it escapes even the category of negation and subsists instead as an ontic anti-field. The anti-field is not the absence of being but the immanent plenitude of non-possibility, a state that obliterates the coherence of both metaphysical foundations and transcendental horizons. One might be tempted to ask whether this framework reduces all to chaos, but to pose such a question is already to misunderstand the nature of the subterranean fracture. Chaos, as typically conceived, presupposes a contrast with order, yet the fracture annihilates this presupposition, leaving in its wake not chaos, but an indeterminate flux that resists both conceptual and aesthetic delimitation. It is neither chaotic nor orderly, but ultra-dynamic, a state in which all oppositional categories implode into an unthinkable singularity that perpetually displaces itself. It is within this ultra-dynamic anti-field that we must locate the ethical implications of the will to other. Ethics, as traditionally understood, dissolves under the weight of this metaphysical parallax, for the ethical presupposes a stable subject capable of agency. However, within the fracture, agency itself is reconstituted as a paradoxical non-agency, a mode of action that neither acts nor refrains from acting, but inhabits the aporetic interval between both. This non-agency is not passivity, but a hyperactive passivity, an agency beyond agency that operates within the limits of its own impossibility. Thus, the will to other becomes the groundless ground of a new ontological praxis. A praxis that neither seeks nor achieves, but perpetually fails in a manner so profound that its failure becomes its only success. It is a praxis that annihilates the distinction between praxis and theory, dissolving both into the hyper-intentional flow of the subterranean fracture. This flow, however, is not a linear progression, but a recursive unmaking, a return that never arrives and a departure that never begins. To conclude, though any conclusion here must remain provisional, the metaphysical parallax of sentient essence forces us to confront the radical finitude of all conceptual apparatuses. It demands of us not understanding but surrender, a surrender so complete that it annihilates the very self that surrenders. And in this annihilation, one glimpses, however fleetingly, the terrifying beauty of the will to other, a beauty so profound that it obliterates all who dare to behold it.